More accidents happen on the table saw than any other machine in the wood shop. Something like 30,000 hand injuries alone are reported to the Consumer Product Safety Commission from the table saw. And even though so many accidents happen on the table saw, most woodworkers don't understand why or how that happens. Primarily, the most common cause of accidents on the table saw is from table saw kickback. And of course, the table saw blade is the most dangerous part of the table saw. A typical blade raised about this high on a 10-inch saw turns at about 4,000 RPMs. That's about 120 miles an hour at the outside periphery. Basically, if something is thrown at 120 miles an hour, it can cause quite a bit of damage. Let me show you something about this blade. I'm going to actually turn it on, take a piece of wood, and throw it into the front of the blade. Now, you might think this is crazy, but watch what happens. Ready? Basically, the piece of wood doesn't go anywhere. At the front of the blade tips are coming down. There really is not any force pushing the wood back. Now you may be saying, oh, I know, kickback happens at the back of the blade. Well, that's sort of true. Let me show you exactly how it happens. When you're cutting a piece of wood, typically ripping it, and you're pushing it into the blade and you come to the back of the blade, all that has to happen for kickback to occur is for this piece of wood to move over the line where the blade is cutting. Now sometimes it just sort of shaves it, but many times because the teeth are sharp and pointed, it can actually make a purchase in the wood. So it comes around, and this tooth coming up, not the back teeth, it's the tooth that's just coming up from below the table that actually sticks into the wood and starts to lift it a little bit. Once it lifts it, it actually starts pulling it over. It's wedged between the fence and the blade, except now the blade has it. The teeth are sticking in, first the one tooth, then the next tooth, until it pulls it all the way around and actually lifts it up on top of the blade. And then when it reaches the apex of the blade, that's when it throws it. Now remember that this is turning at 120 miles per hour. 120 miles an hour is so fast that from what I understand, you can't even see it. Now you may have heard you should stand to the left of the blade. In other words, don't stand in front of the blade. Stand over to the left of the blade when you're actually doing ripping on the saw. But if you notice the way that this piece of wood was being lifted and thrown, it actually throws it to the left of the blade. About the only place you can stand behind the saw and be safe is behind the fence. Now, you're not going to get hit with kickback here, but you're sure going to get a lot of it because it's not a very good way to operate the saw. But for this demonstration, that's where I'm going to stand. Now, what do you think is going to happen if I let go of this right now? It shoots back, but that's not kickback. That wasn't what we were talking about having the saw blade pick it up and throw it. That's something called ejection. And ejection, if you notice, doesn't have very much force. Basically, it's just wedged between the blade and the fence and comes straight back. Now let's really see kickback. I've got a piece of styrofoam here, and I'm going to stand behind the fence. Let's see what happens. Not only does it go pretty fast, but did you notice where it went? To the left. And basically, when you look at a piece of a kicked back piece of wood, this is the pattern that you notice on it. It's got this arc, and it's just as I said, where the kickback initiated was right here. It lifted it up, cut it here, picked it up, and threw it when it reached the top of the blade. Now, why does kickback happen so often at the table saw? It's not really something that you're doing. You don't initiate kickback in any way. It's actually the way the saw is made. There's no place really that you can stand. There's nothing that you can do. There's no way you can push that's going to prevent this from happening. Basically, if you could imagine this, you're coming into the blade is cutting here. We saw a minute ago that it doesn't really push it this way, but that is a point of resistance, an 1/8 inch point of resistance. You're pushing the wood through the blade to the right of the blade. What do you think is going to happen? Basically, if it's resisting here and you're pushing to the right, let's move the fence out of the way, the tendency of the wood as you're pushing forward is to pivot. There is a reason to stand to the left of the blade. Basically, you stand to the left of the blade, I mean, not only because it's more comfortable and because the saw is made for right-handed people, the fence is over here on the right, you're pushing the wood through the blade, but you can hold the wood against the fence and try to counteract this tendency for it to swivel. What do we get for safety at the table saw around the blade? Basically, you probably recognize this device, at least I hope you do. It basically comes on all table saws sold in the United States, all US-made table saws. Most people would call this a guard, but it's not one thing, it's actually three things. The safety regulations for table saws call for 3 safety devices at the blade, and this incorporates all 3 of them together. Basically, the first one is a cover or a hood. The cover sits over the blade and keeps your hands away from the blade, keeps you from having incidental contact with the blade. Whether it's running or not, it's a good idea. But if you remember what we talked about kickback, the blade cover does nothing to prevent kickback from happening. As a matter of fact, that piece of styrofoam, if all we had was a cover over the blade, it would have held it down and actually caused it to shoot even more forcefully. The next thing we have in the 3-in-1 device are these things. These are called Anti-Kickback Fingers, or PAWLs, P-A-W-L-S. And basically, they are not anti-kickback at all. They have little teeth on them, they're spring-loaded, typically, sometimes they're weighted, and they sit on either side of the blade. What they really do is they are the ones that could stop what we call ejection. If it were up to me, I'd get rid of them altogether because I don't feel like we really need them and they get in the way. This is the device that prevents kickback from happening. It almost would be more clear for woodworkers if we renamed it Anti-Kickback Plate or something along those lines. When this sits behind the blade, and again, remember how kickback happens, it's the wood coming around onto the back teeth. This piece of metal behind the blade is a barrier. It prevents the wood from getting on the back teeth. The trouble is that out of all the demonstrations I do on table saw and table saw safety, when I have the audience raise their hand, how many people actually use this on their table saw, it's consistently 5% or less only that use this guard on the table saw. Now, you probably have lots of reasons and you've heard a lot of different things. I believe that it is 2 main reasons why people aren't using it. One, we've all heard that it's not very friendly. This only works when we make what we call through cuts. It doesn't work, we cannot use this guard on here when we do non-through cuts. A non-through cut is a groove. The second reason that I believe that woodworkers are not using their guard is because it's in the culture. In other words, the people that have gone before us, the woodworkers and table saw users that have gone before us, send a clear message that we just don't use this, that it's more dangerous to use it than not, that it's too much trouble to use it. Everything that you see, every book, every magazine, every television show, if you look at those and you look in the beginning of the book, it usually says, oh, using the table saw is very dangerous. Be sure to use your guard. But as you go through it, you never ever see somebody using the guard. Everything that they're doing has the guard off. And they typically say, oh, the guard is removed for clarity, so you can see what we're doing better. But most every woodworker knows that's not the reason it's off. It's off because they don't use it. So as a new user, you come to the table saw and you run into a situation where you may have had the guard on and you took it off to make a cut. So you come to the saw and you try to remember everything that everybody said, stand to the left of the blade, wrap your fingers over the fence, and you go ahead and make the cut. And guess what? You probably don't get hurt. And the more you do that, the more you get used to using the saw without the blade cover on there. And after a while, I hear woodworkers saying, 10 fingers, 20 years, aren't I safe? Well, basically, that's not very good logic. Basically, what I say is you're really just lucky. I mean, it could be 10 years in one day that you can get hurt. So what can you do if you want to be safe at the saw now that you understand how kickback occurs? One thing I would strongly suggest, if you don't have any other alternatives at the moment, the next time you go use your saw, if you can still find it, is to put on the actual cover that came with the saw. It may not be as bad as you might think. It certainly does prevent kickback, even though it may not be the most convenient tool to use. The real stopper of kickback is the splitter or riving knife. In terms of splitters, we have fewer choices than we do overarm blade covers. This one I used for years. This is called a disappearing splitter made by Delta. Basically, the splitter, again, that sits behind the blade, this whole assembly attaches below the table. When you need the splitter, you can pull it up, and when you don't need it, why they call it disappearing, you can push it down below the table, put your throat plate back on, and go ahead and make your non-through cuts. Delta, since this, came up with a newer splitter. It's called a removable splitter that they sell with their Uniguard, and it's a little bit different. The body also mounts onto the trunnion bracket on the back of the saw, underneath the throat plate, under the table, and the splitter itself drops in like so, and you tighten up a plate to make it sturdy on the saw. When you don't need it anymore, when you need to make a through cut, you take off the throat plate, move the knob out, and pull it out, so it comes out pretty easily. The other one that we have is called a drop-in spreader. This is made by Biesmeyer. Biesmeyer made an overarm guard, and they decided that to make the package complete, they would also come up with a splitter. The splitter body with the anti-kickback balls actually fit down into this slot, snap into a spring-loaded plunger here. So when you're using it, it's like this. When you don't need it, you lift up the throat plate or even drill a hole in your throat plate and pull it out, and it's gone, and you can make your non-through cut. The last and the newest one that you have a choice from that is on the market now is made by Excalibur. They call it a Merlin, kind of like the magician. Now you see it, now you don't. And basically, again, you install a holder underneath the saw, and this one has a little socket in it. This long body fits in behind the blade and snaps into place, gives you a splitter body, keeping you from having kickback. When you don't need it, you push a button and you take it out. Now you may have heard the term riving knife, which is different than the term splitter, although some people use the two, mix them up together. But a splitter does not move up and down with the blade. A splitter is stationary, it stays into place. It'll tilt with the blade, but basically it stays into place. Okay. Now this is a riving knife, and the main difference between a riving knife and a splitter is that the riving knife fits behind the blade in some sort of a holder that can be adjusted back and forth. And when you raise and lower the blade, the riving knife stays at the same proximity to the blade no matter where you go. And that means that I can actually adjust it to be just a little bit lower than the top of the blade. If I'm making a non-through cut, such as a groove, and I'm running it over the blade, when I come to the riving knife, it doesn't interfere at all with the wood, and I can go right over it, which really means that I never have to take it off. A riving knife by itself, even though it prevents the most common cause of accidents on the table saw, is not enough. You also need a blade cover. And a good solution for a blade cover is one that comes on and off easily, because we have to take it on and off whenever we make a non-through cut. Even though this doesn't get in the way of making a non-through cut, if we have a cover on here or a blade guard on here, we can't make that same cut with this on here. And the solution on this one is to make one that comes on and off easily, as it does on this particular saw. But as you know, most table saws come with throat plates, and the throat plate opening is much bigger than what we need. And many of us, sell aftermarket throat plates. You can make your own throat plates, for instance, this one for dadoing, and this one for a typical saw blade. This is something that we do a lot at the table saw because it gives us better cutting and it's safer to use as well. Bigger pieces can't get caught down in the saw and be thrown back at you. If you can make a zero clearance throat plate or buy a zero clearance throat plate, you can simply just take a piece of wood and stick it in the groove behind the blade. And really what that does is it is a splitter that prevents the wood from coming around on the back of the blade. Now that you've seen the demonstration, you understand how kickback happens. And all you really need is some sort of a device behind the blade that keeps the wood from getting on the back. And this is something that anybody can do.